This is Dana Stamus with Martial Arts Enterprises, and today Martial Arts and Action Entertainment will bring you a great interview with American screenwriter, film director, and producer Sheldon Lettich. He is well known for his numerous martial arts films, including 1988's Bloodsport, for which he wrote the story and the screenplay. Now, before we begin, Mr. Lettich, I have one question for you.
Yeah.
I want to know about the pink motif that you used in Double Impact. Were you paid by Judo Jean LaBelle for the subliminal advertising using the pink karate gis?
No, our production designer came up with that color scheme because it was supposed to be this sort of upscale, West Hollywood, Beverly Hills kind of a dojo, and so we added some upscale colors to it, stuff that you wouldn't normally find. I've never seen a dojo that had uniforms that color before.
That's kind of Judo Jean LaBelle's his trademark is the pink gi, and he's a pretty tough guy. So when we watch that, we always kind of laugh because he's the only one we knew of that could get away with wearing a pink gi. And you didn't tangle with him, let me tell you.
No, we that was completely unintentional. That was just an idea that the production designer came up with, and I thought it was appropriate. What's that?
And we noticed it throughout with the pink shorts and the pink gears on the boat. So we kind of saw it in numerous places.
It's amazing, people who've seen this movie pick out details that I've never noticed before. Like I didn't realize that there was that we were using pink in various spots of the movie, and you just brought that up to me, and it was completely unintentional. In fact, for Jean-Claude, the costume designer did not have those pink shorts picked out for him. We had some long pants, as I recall. And Jean-Claude had those pink shorts himself, and he says to me before we started shooting the scene, "Hey, how about if I wear these? It makes more sense that I would be dressed like this flying on the plane." And I thought, well, it kind of suits the character, and he did use that color in his dojo, so sure, let's go with it. But it was not something that was consciously planned out ahead of time.
Now that's interesting because I certainly picked it up throughout. So, and maybe a little bit of that comes from him. In Double Impact, there was the one guy who was relatively violent and the one guy who was very mellow, and so I think that that kind of motif picked that up as well. And that's interesting. I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, those are like two sides of Jean-Claude's personality, actually. The two brothers were based on different aspects of Jean-Claude's actual personality. So he really is those two guys. He's got, a lot of us do, but he pretty much has multiple personalities within him. And since I knew him so well, I was able to draw those out and turn them into characters that pretty much contrasted with one another.
And then that actually comes into with him being a Shotokan practitioner as well as a ballet dancer. Two very different sides of him. Right.
And he was definitely both. I know he studied ballet in Belgium and studied Shotokan, and we were able to show both aspects in the movie.
Yeah, the hard soft. It was very cool.
Right.
It was very cool. Well, I have a lot to talk to you about today, and I know that most of what I'd like to talk about is Bloodsport, if that's okay with you.
Fine.
Couple things. I think in this situation, Frank Dux his character became bigger than life. And I think oftentimes, and because Bloodsport is such an important movie.
It's become this iconic martial arts movie. And we knew we had something good with that project, but I didn't think I'd be talking about it 30 years later as much as I do, and going to screenings and things like that. So.
And now we're introducing it to a whole new generation of martial artists, which is fun to do as well. But
Absolutely.
on that same note, like I was saying, I think Frank Dux became bigger than life, and people will often do and say things about them, both good and bad, that aren't true, because you want to bond with that individual. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's just so many stories about Frank, and I can no longer tell which are true and which are false. I've actually given
most of them are false. Okay, anything heroic, anything noble is false. Okay.
Well, let's go through this. Let's go through this together, and let's start with the actual story from Bloodsport, because you actually not only wrote the screenplay, but you really wrote the story. And
it was pretty much, these were stories that Frank himself was spinning. He mentioned the word Bloodsport to me. We were driving in my car one day, and he had been telling me about this kumite that he participated in, and even showed me an article. He somehow convinced the editor of Black Belt magazine, who was Jon Stewart at the time, that he participated in this kumite, and they published an article about it. And so I read this article, and I really didn't know much about martial arts or the martial arts world at the time. And I figured, as anybody would, well, if the editor of Black Belt magazine wrote this article and he's saying this is true and that he had it checked out, well, I suppose that there's some truth to it. And that's what convinced me and a lot of people, beyond Frank just telling us the story and saying that all of this really occurred. We had validation from Black Belt magazine. So that's where the story came from. But if anything, the real story came from Frank. I'm the one who figured out how to package it into a screenplay, how to turn it into a story, how to give it a beginning, middle, and end, and make it entertaining. So that was pretty much my contribution, besides writing the first few drafts of the screenplay. But as far as the story, that's something. The actual story behind the screen story is what Frank was telling people that he really did. And he was also at the same time, he was telling people that he was in Vietnam. He did all these secret missions. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, and in addition to a number of other medals for valor. He was a secret agent for the CIA. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that Frank was telling back then. And
he's still telling it today.
Yeah, of course, because he has to make, now that it's all been out there, you know, the movie Bloodsport. Then he wrote this book called The Secret Man, detailing all of his CIA adventures. He has to keep it up, because otherwise, he has to admit that his entire life has been a fraud. Everything that he's said has been phony, made up.
It's an impossibility, because with the internet, with the internet, he can't hold on to that any longer. Right.
Yeah. But he does, because if he didn't, then he would have to admit, I've been lying about everything my entire life, lying about my military service, lying about work for the CIA. Everything has been a fantasy of his.
How could any one person keep something up like this? I mean, he's a legend in that, and Bloodsport made him a legend, made Frank Dux a legend. And I'm really, really sad to have that be destroyed. Right.
Yeah. So many people have said that. So many people have said, when the truth gets revealed, they say, well, thanks for ruining my childhood. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for knocking my idol off of his pedestal. But that's the truth. Basically, Frank is a con man. And he's a very good con man. He's a very skilled con man. He's really good at convincing people that all of this stuff is true. And he's still convincing people to this very day that this stuff is true.
So there's just too many stories. There's just too much out there to allow So in this situation, if I were Frank, how do you save face and see, I would really like to see Frank start living his own life, real life.
There is no way for him to save face. All he can do is keep maintaining the lie. Otherwise, he would have to admit that it's all been a lie all along. Bloodsport and The Secret Man, all of this has been a lie.
Okay, so
there's no way he can do that.
Okay, well, let's say we do. Let's say we allow him to do that. We say, okay, we're going to allow you to do this. We love the movie Bloodsport. We don't want to damage it anymore. We don't want to. So we're going to allow you to come out and say, hey, and the movie's still there. Without Frank Dux, we wouldn't have the movie. And if you've read The Secret Man, it's a great book. It's funny. I mean, it was a good read. I enjoyed reading it. I didn't take it truthfully, but I enjoyed reading it.
Right. It's well written.
Yeah. Why can't we get him to the point where he can just be himself? Go ahead and be that legend without having, I mean, there's many people who stories are written about. Movies are normally not completely true. And I just wish we could get him to that place where he could do that, where he could tell the truth. And
you're not going to get him there. You're simply not going to get him there. He's just very, very stubborn, hard-headed, and he's got, there's a lot of other personal business at stake and monetary business at stake if he was to come clean and say, yeah, I made it all up. I lied about everything. So what would those be? What at this point in time would it be? Well, his current wife, for example, she defends his record and defends him. Well,
she has no choice. Yeah, she doesn't know. She has no choice. I mean, she didn't know the truth to start with. So
correct. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's a sad situation because she says that she's a journalist. But if she's a journalist, then she really needs to do her homework, because that's, the truth is out there and it's, so besides her.
She could call me like you're calling me.
Yeah.
Okay. And ask me some questions because I knew Frank way before she did. And I knew, two of his ex-wives.
Yes.
And the ex-wives were also under the impression that all of this was true.
True. Yeah.
When they found out it wasn't, that led to some issues, and led to divorces, and of course led to Frank making up all kinds of accusations about getting divorced because he actually accused the journalist, the LA Times journalist, I think his name is Joe Johnson, the first one who wrote an expose article about Frank in the LA Times.
Right.
And Frank, on numerous occasions, has said that guy was having an affair with his wife. Right. Nothing could be further from the truth, but, with him, the lies just never end. He just builds lie upon lie upon lie to try to justify himself. So those two marriages ended in divorce, and the wives, and I used to know Frank pretty well.
Right.
And so I knew some of his girlfriends also. Everybody figures it out sooner or later. So when this current wife figures it out, when her family figures it out, that's going to create some personal problems for Frank, just like it's created personal problems in the past.
Yeah, it's already doing that.
I've heard, yes, that's what I've heard. Yeah. But, that's where, he's not really. People seem to think he's wealthy, but he's not. It's his wife's family that's got the money. So there's another reason.
He had money from his mom and the sale of her home. So he put a lot of money into this. But you're right. Yeah, people have but they often have that with the entertainment industry. You know, they think that, you know, certain things are happening when it's not. Let me ask you another question about his ability as a fight choreographer. When you, because I've come to this place where there's just so much information about him, I honestly don't know what to believe. And I kind of want to start from the very beginning.
Okay.
And I mean, there's certain things that were said that he trains, like Jeff Langton, he trained certain people, which I know is not true.
Recently he said he trained Paco Prieto, completely false.
Yeah.
And Paco was pretty offended when he saw that.
Yeah, so a lot of these guys, but how was he as a martial artist? I mean, how did you see him working as a fight choreographer? Did he seem like he was very skilled at what he was doing, or was Jean-Claude actually using his own training that he'd already had, more or less, or, you know, what?
Frank's got a very vivid imagination, and he knows a lot about martial arts just from knowing martial artists and observing martial artists. But I never saw him actually spar with anybody. I never saw him actually do any of the stuff that he talks about.
Okay, but on the set, was he actually coordinating the fights? I mean, was he creating those fight scenes?
They were being worked out. They were being worked out between him and Michel Qissi. Michel Qissi played one of the. Michel was an old friend of Jean-Claude's from Belgium. Right. Yeah, and Michel played. Yeah, he played one of the Legionnaires, and he also played Tong Po and kickboxer. So Michel really knew his business, and it's not that. And Frank and Michel, they were coming up with some good stuff. This is why Frank got hired to work on Lionheart, because he worked with Jean-Claude on Bloodsport and came up with a lot of the ideas for the fight choreography in Bloodsport, and Jean-Claude was kind of impressed with him and liked working with him. So we ended up hiring him for Lionheart, and he worked on Lionheart, and he did come up with a lot of good ideas. He had great ideas. It's not that he would actually perform this stuff and show the fighters what to do. It was all talk. He would mostly talk about this stuff, but he came up with some really decent ideas. I thought Jean-Claude and I both thought he had a terrific imagination and had a certain amount of knowledge about martial arts and fighting. Like I said, I never saw him spar with anybody. I've seen Jean-Claude spar with world champions, and Jean-Claude is the real deal. But Frank, no.
But you have to understand fighting to be able to choreograph stuff. I mean, you have to, not only that, but you have to understand camera angles. You have to understand a lot of different things that.
Well, we had Michel and Jean-Claude on the set also. Right. And Michel and Frank would come up with some ideas for fights, and Jean-Claude would end up changing a lot of stuff before we actually rolled cameras. And as far as camera angles, no, I was choosing the camera angles. Okay. And every so often Jean-Claude would say, hey, why don't we get a shot from over here? So Jean-Claude had some contributions, and he's got a very good cinematic mind. And a lot of the fights were co-choreographed by him. In fact, all three of them get fight choreographer credit on Lionheart. Yeah. So then I ended up getting Frank hired to do the fight choreography on Only the Strong also, based on my work with him on Lionheart. Mm-hmm. And on Only the Strong, he really wasn't doing much of anything. he and Paco went out. Paco Prieto was a co-choreographer on Only the Strong, and they basically canvassed all the dojos in Miami, and they found a bunch of fighters. But that was another thing that Frank did on Lionheart also. We had an open call for fighters to be in Lionheart. And the place where we had the auditions was at Frank's dojo in North Hollywood.
North Hollywood.
Yeah. And we had 1,000 people show up, 1,000 fighters.
Wow.
That was a lot. It was a lot. Yeah, it was a crowd of people. And we, Frank and Michel would basically go through them one at a time, have them show some of their stuff, try to repeat a few things. But it was mostly Michel is the one that would be saying, can you do this and can you do that? Because Michel could really do this stuff.
Right.
And so Frank helped us pick the fight. He picked like the initial group, which we then narrowed down after they met Jean-Claude. So he was instrumental in helping us with that. And then he and Paco did the same thing on Only the Strong. They went, rather than going to stuntmen, we did end up having a few stuntmen in the movie, people who actually were stuntmen. But we were looking for some raw talent that hadn't been seen in movies before. And we did find quite a few people that had never been in a movie before. Like Paco Prieto we found him for Lionheart, and then I ended up using him to be the villain in Only the Strong, and he went on and did a few other movies. But that was an example of somebody that we found that had not been seen in a movie before.
And then Mark Dacascos was pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, that was Only the Strong.
Yeah, and, right. Yeah, he was. He's a good guy.
And he was recommended to me by his agent at the time because she knew that we were making this martial arts movie about capoeira, and so she got in touch with me and she said, "Well, you should meet my client Mark," and that's basically how I met Mark. And we put that movie together.
Yeah, he's turned into a very good actor as well as a martial artist.
Absolutely.
I really like him a lot. There's
a lot of stuff he can do. Like Jean-Claude was good with kicks, with punches, stuff like that, but he didn't know how to use any weapon other than guns. But Mark could do it all. He could do the acrobatics. He could do sticks and swords, knives, all that stuff. He knew how to do all of that stuff. Right. So he was pretty damn impressive.
Yeah, he is. I was really surprised that he didn't really become another Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Right.
Because he's absolutely so talented.
Yeah, well, 20th Century Fox thought that he had a shot to step into Brandon Lee's shoes because we were working on Only the Strong shortly after Brandon Lee died. And Brandon Lee had a contract with 20th Century Fox.
Right.
So they had made a couple movies with him and they were looking forward to making more, and suddenly he's gone. And they thought that Mark could pretty much take his place. So they actually had a 3-picture deal with Mark Dacascos.
And what happened?
What happened is his manager, the one who had actually gotten me in touch with him in the first place, got him signed to do another movie. After we finished Only the Strong, she got him signed to a movie called Double Dragon, which was based on a video game.
Right.
And that movie turned into a complete disaster. They went way, way over schedule. I'm talking about, I think it was about 2 months over schedule. Yeah, it was really a mess and over budget.
Budget, that's the key to everything, the budget.
and we had a schedule from 20th Century Fox to go on a promotional tour for Only the Strong. If I'm not mistaken, it was about 12 cities. I still have the paperwork somewhere. I think it was 12 cities in the U.S. They were going to fly us to all these cities, Mark and Paco and myself, and they were going to give some demonstrations. We were going to do screenings of the movie. Well, Mark couldn't do any of that because he was stuck on Double Dragon, and the people at 20th Century Fox eventually just threw up their hands and they just said, okay, well, we're just going to have to throw this movie out there. You know, nobody's ever heard of Mark Dacascos before. We were going to try to build him up to be this movie star, and we're not able to do it because they couldn't hold the movie forever, and eventually they just kind of dumped it out there, and so it didn't do all that well. Double Dragon was a complete disaster. It's a terrible movie and made no money and I don't think it even opened theatrically. So that was a combination of factors that pretty much killed his career right at the beginning. Now he's went on to do a lot of stuff just because he is so talented and was able to overcome that. You know, he's got the looks, he's got the acting ability, he can do the acrobatics. There's a lot of stuff that he was able to do. So he prevailed, even though there were so many negatives working against him right at the beginning. But I felt that if he hadn't done Double Dragon and we were able to do that promotional tour, the movie would have done a lot better, and he would have been elevated into the same ranks as Van Damme and Seagal and a number of other fighters. You know, because he's got the talent, but he just had a bad break there, and the bad break was totally due to his manager overbooking him and booking him onto something that turned out to be a disaster. So that's so much for Mark. Now, while we're on the subject of Mark, so while we were working on Only the Strong, as I mentioned, Frank and Paco went out and they found all these fighters, and we tested them all out, and we ended up using nearly every one of them in the movie. But then after doing that, Frank was just off doing stuff that he didn't need to be doing. He'd be on the cell phone constantly, yelling at people about whatever different subjects. Had nothing to do with the movie. When we'd have these sessions to choreograph the fights, he either wouldn't be there or he just wouldn't make much of a contribution. He'd be, again, busy on his cell phone. And Mark got really fed up with him and just felt that this guy was wasting everybody's time. I was Frank's biggest defender on that because everybody slowly started getting disenchanted with Frank, even though they were all impressed at first that, this is the guy who, the story of Bloodsport is this guy's story. So they were impressed at first, and little by little, people started questioning any kind of faith that they had in Frank. And we ended up having to get other people to do the fight choreography because Frank was just not doing it. Just wasn't doing his job. So we had a martial arts master named Amain Santos. So he was our martial arts expert. We had a stunt coordinator named Artie Maleshi, who was a very well-respected stunt coordinator in South Florida. We had Paco. And Mark himself was able to come up with some great ideas. And so between us, we were doing the choreography, and Frank was doing nothing. And eventually, the producers got disenchanted with him, and everybody wanted to get rid of Frank. And since he had been a friend of mine, and I'm the one who recommended him, so I'm the one who had egg all over my face for recommending him in the first place. But I was the last holdout. Oh, and my co-writer also, Luis Esteban, was a genuine martial artist from New York City. And everybody started getting fed up with Frank. And so finally, I told him, I didn't want to just say, hey, Frank, you're fired. Everybody hates you. It was, I think this was late October, early November. I said, hey, Frank, I got some good news for you. You're going to be able to be home for Thanksgiving. And I think he read between the lines. He says, oh, what do you mean? We still have some fight scenes to do. And I told him, yeah, we've kind of got those covered. You know, you pretty much set us on the right path, and we feel we can just do those ourselves, and we're going to send you home early, okay? That was a polite way of putting it, and nobody else would have put it that politely, but I did. But basically, Frank was fired because he wasn't doing anything. And Mark, of everybody involved with this, Mark was the one who was the most disgruntled because he was expecting this guy to come up with some cool fight choreography, and without Jean-Claude and Michel Qissi there, he really wasn't able to do anything. He didn't come up with anything.
Yeah, see, that was my question. That was my question right there. So, yeah,
he likes to talk about the fact that he was a fight choreographer on that movie. And he also, I noticed that he, on IMDb, he got himself listed as stunt coordinator and fight choreographer. And I had to get in touch with IMDb and tell him, no, not true. And we did actually put him in the movie in this one scene, in the chop shop scene. There's this big fight in the chop shop. And Frank did come up with a few of the gags for that one. He was the guy in the welding outfit. Yeah, and that was really Frank. And I believe Mark gives him a kick and he goes flying, and that was really Frank doing that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's accurate to say that he did stunts because he was pretty much a stunt man in that scene. Unfortunately, it cast a stigma over the entire industry.
Exactly.
Because if Frank Dux is a phony, if Frank Dux was lying, well then who else isn't full of shit? Okay, so I think it's harmful in that way.
And it's really harmed people like Don Wilson and a lot of these guys who are really good, martial artists. And for Frank to come out and say, hey, I'm the world's best. When I've absolutely never seen anything that was him. I've never seen not one piece of footage with him fighting anywhere. The one piece that he said was him is not. No,
none of it's true. And the whole Marine Corps story, he was, so some people did the research. They submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, and they got his real military records. And he was in the reserves for a short period of time, and was not an intelligence operative. He was a wireman. He strung wire between phone poles. That was it, and only did it on weekends and 2 weeks in the summer when he was in the reserves. But he never went overseas. He never went on any real missions. He was never with a real functioning military unit. the entire time he was in.
The one thing I worry about is because I know that so many people have vouched for him just because he's Frank Dux. I hate to have to talk to people like you about this. You've got, so many things that you've done, and I've thoroughly enjoyed a lot of your movies. And
But then Frank has lied about me. He has claimed in a number of interviews that he wrote the original script for Bloodsport under the title Enter the Ninja.
Enter the Ninja, yeah.
Which is completely ludicrous because that's a canon film, and it was written. This script was originally by Mike Stone. Frank had nothing to do with it, but he says he wrote Bloodsport under the title Enter the Ninja, and that I then plagiarized it from him. That I stole it. I basically took his script and put my name on it. Well, that's pretty damn insulting, and that has really raised my hackles, and that's why I come after Frank, because now he's lying about me, he's insulting me, he's trying to bolster himself by saying that he's the one that actually wrote the script. If anybody was to believe that, that's harmful to me, because I've been a member of the Writers Guild for 30 years, I've got numerous screen credits, and I don't need somebody saying that I'm a thief, that I stole his script and put my name on it. And I have all the original contracts from Bloodsport, which I have put online a number of times just to illustrate how much of a liar he is, because the original contracts basically say that I'm being hired to write this movie based on the, quote, true life story of Frank Dux, which we have the rights to. So basically, he sold the rights to his alleged true life story to Mark DeSalle, and Mark then in turn transferred those rights to Canon Films. And I've posted the contract between me and Mark DeSalle, and between Mark DeSalle and Canon Films, and it's all stated there very clearly in black and white that I was hired to write the screenplay. So, Frank just keeps making a fool of himself by alleging otherwise.
Well, I'm hoping that with this interview we can kind of get that out again and help people to understand. Because what you did, Bloodsport's important. What you did was important, and putting all the pieces together matters to me. The truth matters to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, really appreciate you taking the time. I know this is not a subject you enjoy talking about. And I think there's been many other interviews where you've said, let's discuss something else. But I really appreciate it. Right,
yeah. Well, the reason I say that is because Frank is a publicity hound. He loves to get his name out there. There is no such thing as bad publicity for him, even though he says that there is, because we're discussing him, we're getting his name out there. It just creates more.
Definitely.
More. It just publicizes the name, and there's going to be people out there who will think, well, we're the ones that are full of shit. Frank's telling the truth.
Right.
Okay.
That's why I'm hoping they'll listen to this interview if they don't want to read the facts. Now, let me ask you anything. Did you know anything about the brain tumor that he had? Was that ever evident or anything with that?
I actually visited him in the hospital at Cedars-Sinai Hospital. This is back when we were still on friendly terms with one another. He had a big scar on his forehead. You could see where the surgeons had cut in. And with Frank, since he lies about so many things, I believe at the time he was saying it was a brain tumor, but then he said other things to other people. This was after his encounter with Zane Frazier, at that martial arts event where Zane Frazier punched him in the head.
Right.
So I have a feeling it might have been related to that. And somebody did some research and was able to pull up all of the lawsuits that Frank Dux has filed against people.
Right.
And Frank actually sued Zane Frazier.
Oh, that's because he told everybody that he was wearing brass knuckles when he hit him.
Yeah, well, just to make it seem like, and he's saying he was ambushed,
right?
And that Zane Frazier was wearing brass knuckles. Since Frank is just he's just so well known for lying and exaggerating everything, I would doubt that Zane Frazier was wearing brass knuckles.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. There was some of the Gracies were there. Some certain people were there. There
were witnesses, right?
Yeah,
right.
There was
but Frank did sue afterwards.
Yeah, so, but he lost.
He lost. Frank has never won a lawsuit. That was one thing that was evident from this legal paperwork that somebody pulled up. I forgot where it is right now, but I've seen this a couple times. Somebody pulled it up. It's from some legal site that like a lawyer's research group or something like that. And he has sued a number of people and has never won. But when he talks about these lawsuits, he talks about the lawsuit versus Soldier of Fortune magazine over and over again.
Right.
And makes it sound like he won, like that he prevailed, but he did not. It didn't even go to trial. The judge threw it out. And the Medal of Honor controversy. He used to tell everybody that he was a Medal of Honor winner. And so we were shooting this little movie at Camp Pendleton, which is another interesting little aspect of the Frank Dux bullshit story. We're at Camp Pendleton, and so I'm talking to some of the officers there about getting permission to film there. And my producer, this guy named Peter DeBear, had mentioned to them, one of the stars of our movie is a Medal of Honor winner, by the way. And this officer says, "Oh, really? Let me look that up." So he happened to have a book with the names of all the Medal of Honor winners, and curiously, Frank Dux is not listed there. Yeah. So we asked Frank about that afterwards, and he says, which he used the same excuse that a lot of these stolen valor liars will use. It was a secret Medal of Honor awarded to me by the president, but they couldn't publicize it because the mission itself was secret.
Right.
All of which is bullshit. And then Frank even showed me the Medal of Honor. I was at his house in Woodland Hills. This is when he was married to a woman named Yvonne. Mm-hmm. And he brings it out in his living room and shows it to me. He had it like draped over a piece of plexiglass. It was like some kind of a display device for a medal like that. And so he showed it to me. Now, this was back in the pre-cell phone days, okay? Because if I'd had a cell phone with a camera, I would have taken a picture of it, but I didn't. So that would have been proof that he did show this to me. But I'm not a liar. I'm not lying now. He showed me this Medal of Honor and said it was his. Now, what I didn't realize at the time was that most of these medals will have, especially like a Medal of Honor, Silver Star, something like that, they'll have the name of the person engraved into the medal. Mm-hmm. And this is something that Jeff Langton told me because his dad was a collector of military medals. And had I known that, I would have said, hey, let me take a closer look at that, Frank, to see if his name was engraved in it. But I didn't do that. But he did show it to me and said, yeah, this was awarded to me. So just one more bullshit story. And then, of course, afterwards, after I told people about this, when I did a few interviews where I talked about that, then he claimed that I'm the one who was lying, that he'd never showed me a Medal of Honor. So, again, the kind of stuff that raises my hackles. Now so the liar is calling me a liar. That's what he is. He's no martial artist. He's a con man. He's just everything about this guy's life is just bullshit. It's a con.
Yeah.
I've read some interviews with him where he's talked about his childhood, his difficult childhood, that his parents were poor and they couldn't afford shoes. You read any of this stuff? It's just ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, I have.
And he lived in this comfortable middle-class home in North Hollywood. His dad worked at Burbank Airport. He was some kind of a aircraft mechanic. Frank talks about like not having shoes to wear, like he was something out of a Charles Dickens novel.
Yeah.
So,
well, that comes down to him, with Ruasaki, standing outside his dojo training because he couldn't afford to be inside.
Yeah. But somehow they had enough money where his brother Steve, he has a brother named Stephen Dux, who lives in Israel, and Steve was somehow Steve went to USC, and somehow he was on the USC football team. So somebody had some money somewhere, unless he got a 100% football scholarship or something like that. But I don't believe he did. So the family was not poor. I was at their house a few times. They weren't wealthy, but they were basically middle class. Middle
class, the same as the rest of us, I think. Well, and I think part of the whole problem is that many people were willing to say things and willing, to stand up in ways to say, oh yeah, Frank said this, it's true. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't. And I think that allowed him to continue to do this year after year.
Casts a bit of a stigma over legitimate martial artists because people generally, you read about somebody like Frank, and you might start thinking, well, actually, every one of these people are full of shit. People have disparaged Bruce Lee, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that Frank is so well known because of Bloodsport and has been proven over and over to be a fraud and a liar. It just makes you start questioning anything that any martial artist is going to say to you.
Yes, I agree. The character of Frank Dux is somebody to people. And
right.
they don't know that he's a fraud. Now the internet is allowing them to see that.
We had no internet back when I first met Frank,
right.
And he was spinning these tales. And what's amazing to me is that he was able to convince Jon Stewart, the editor of Black Belt, that all of this had actually occurred and was true. And of course, Frank was basically saying the same thing about the Kumite that he's saying about his secret military missions. Well, it's all very hush hush, and if I told you, I'd have to kill you. That kind of thing.
Right.
So
right.
nobody's going to admit it because they're all sworn to secrecy. So the U.S. government is not going to admit that I did all these secret missions because it would embarrass them. So so they're telling these lies about me to protect themselves. There was no way to look in. There was no Freedom of Information Act back then.
Right.
So you could not petition the government and say, can I see Frank Dux' military records?
Right.
Nowadays you can. People have done it, and they found that those records are paper thin. They're almost non-existent.
Right, and he's got an excuse for it all. Hey, don't you see a really good movie in this? Let's do the true story of Frank Dux. I mean, this is...
Oh, I have thought about that, and other people have said that too, but you'll never get him to give his permission for something like that to happen.
I mean, look what he's been able to accomplish as a con man. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Right. Well, it's pretty much... I was just talking to somebody about this recently who was saying the same thing. well, this sounds like a more interesting story than the story of Bloodsport.
It does. And what if it's a documentary? I mean, they come out with documentaries all the time. As long as it's truthful, the truth is the truth. And you know,
doesn't matter. He can sue just like he sued Van Damme,
right? Anybody
and lost,
right?
Because the thing about Frank is he can never stick with the truth. He's always got to embellish and stretch and lie to support his point of view, which is what he did at the trial. Right. I actually have video footage of the trial because it was broadcast on court TV. A friend of mine recorded it. Unfortunately, he had this is back in the VHS days, and he had a 2-hour VHS, and the trial went on for a few days.
Right.
So he didn't get the whole trial, but he got enough of it to where you can see Frank hedging and bullshitting when he's up on the witness stand.
Wow.
So, anyways, I was there, and the one story he told, which totally blew his case, because initially, and I was there. I was in the courtroom. I'm actually on tape giving testimony. He basically, this is about a movie called The Quest,
mm-hmm.
which he gets a story credit on. Now, how did Frank get involved with The Quest? Well, Jean-Claude wanted me to write the screenplay and wanted me to direct the movie. I was busy with other stuff. I had just finished Only the Strong, and I was doing other stuff. And I said, look, I don't have the time to do it because I've got these other commitments. What about Frank Dux? Because Jean-Claude and I had always agreed, this guy's got a wild imagination, does know something about martial arts. He's not a bad writer. Why don't you hire Frank? And that's what he did. He hired Frank. And then Frank said, and they had contracts, written contracts. Frank got paid some money. But Frank, that wasn't good enough for him. He had to allege that Jean-Claude promised him a percentage of the movie's profits when the movie got made.
Wow.
Jean-Claude has a tendency to say things like that. He probably told Frank, hey, you're going to get a percentage of the profits, okay? It was never on paper. The lawyers had nothing to do with it, but you're going to get a piece of the action.
Right.
Well, then Frank, after the movie came out, sued because he wasn't getting a piece of the profits. He got paid to work on the screenplay, and then they brought other writers in anyways and completely rewrote everything. But he was involved with the initial story.
Right.
So he sued and said, Jean-Claude promised me a piece of the profits, and I want my piece of the profits. And Jean-Claude owes me $1 million. That's what they were suing for, is $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
So it came down to saying, well, where's your proof that Jean-Claude offered you this money? Well, he didn't write it down. He said it, but I secretly had a tape recorder going when he made that promise to me. So I recorded it, and well, great. Where's the recording? Well, I put it in a safe, and that safe was in my apartment. And after the Northridge earthquake, I couldn't get into my apartment. Right. So you know the whole story. Well, that was just such a ludicrous explanation. And like I said, the jury, you could sense that the jury was on Frank's side, okay? Because here's this poor schmuck getting screwed over by this big Hollywood movie star. This guy's worth millions of dollars. Won't pay Frank the little bit of money he's owed for the participation. they were predisposed to give their verdict to Frank. Frank got up there and told so many whoppers that you could sense the jury just turning against him, just getting sick of hearing them. And of course, people weren't saying anything. They were a jury, so they're supposed to keep their mouth shut. But I was there, and so he told that ridiculous lie. And the other thing that he said too, which is unfortunately not on tape, but I was there, I heard it. He said, well, another reason that Jean-Claude turned against me is because I was dating his sister-in-law, which is true. He was actually dating the sister of Jean-Claude's wife, of Gladys Portuguese. Mm-hmm. And Jean-Claude wanted her for himself. He said this up on the witness stand. Afterwards, I was talking to Frank that evening, and I said, Frank, why did you say that? Okay, it's just completely ludicrous, and really put you in a bad light. Not Jean-Claude, put you in a bad light. And he got pissed off at me. And that's pretty much what led to the end of my friendship, was that argument, and where I was just trying to give him some advice, basically telling him, go easy on the lies, Frank, because it doesn't do you any good to come up with some tabloid fodder like that. Jean-Claude turned against me because he wanted to screw my girlfriend. No, that doesn't help you at all. In fact, it hurts you. So we got into a big blow-up about that. And I haven't been his friend since. That was back, that was during the trial. And then, of course, a few days later, the jury sided with Jean-Claude against Frank, because Jean-Claude, he wasn't being 100% honest up on the witness stand either, but Frank's lies were just so outrageous and so over the top that if you had to choose between Frank and Jean-Claude as to who was telling the truth, you'd pick Jean-Claude. Frank did not have it on tape and lied about having it on tape and lied about the apartment being condemned. And Jean-Claude's lawyers found the woman who was the manager of his building at the time, and she got up on a witness stand and said, no, Frank Dux is lying. The apartment was not condemned. He was free to come and go, and he was not barred from entry. So that pretty much blew his story out of the water. Wow.
You know what? It really all comes back to lying.
Yeah.
Lying is never right, no matter what you do, and it's always going to be, the truth will always come out. People don't understand that there are consequences to their actions. And I think Frank is realizing now that those consequences are real.
He's going to keep on maintaining the story. And Frank has got the psychological condition, basically, where somebody makes up some kind of fantastical, heroic tale, and they put themselves they're the star of that tale. He actually convinces himself that he really did this stuff, that the Kumite was real, that he really participated in it, that he really won that trophy. And that's what allows him to keep the fiction going, because he can't really tell the difference between truth and fantasy. He puts himself in these tales and convinces himself that he really did this stuff.
And that's why he can convince others, because he truly believes it.
Yes, yeah, because you could see it in his eyes. He believes this. It's I've mentioned this before. It's really akin to Tom Clancy saying that, I'm really Jack Ryan, and all these Jack Ryan stories that I wrote, all these books, that's really me. That's stuff that I actually did. It's not fiction. That's basic. See, if Frank had been able to separate the fact from the fiction, he could have written all this stuff. He could do this. He could have written a number of novels. He could have wrote Bloodsport as a novel and not made the main character Frank Dux, or made the main character Frank Dux if he wanted to, and then, admitted that, well, it's not really me.
Right.
But that's not what he did. He just has to tell people that it's a true story and I'm the main character and I did all this stuff. So it's basically Tom Clancy saying, yeah, I'm Jack Ryan, and so I wrote all these, I did all this stuff, Hunt for Red October, that was me on the submarine,
Yeah.
But that's the difference between Tom Clancy and Frank Dux.